meridianholistichealth.com.
Okay, so here we are in Devon on a wonderful grey day, and I'm Dr. Susan Lange from the Meridian Centre for Holistic Medicine, and we have here Franklyn Sills, who is the principal of Karuna Institute.
One of the co-directors.
One of the co-directors with more of those. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, hello.
Hello.
So you'd like to know my background?
Yes, yes.
Ah.
And then we'd also like to know what Biodynamic Craniosacral is and your huge contribution to it.
Oh, well, thank you. Like in all of these kinds of things, I never know quite where to start. I think should I look in the camera, I guess?
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever.
Whatever's comfortable.
I think that would be great because you're talking to everybody who...
Hello, everybody. Very kind of you to be watching.
Students, our students.
Like in many of these things, I don't know where to start. In a funny way, life is not linear, and certainly my life hasn't been, and still isn't. I guess, like a lot of you and a lot of us, there's always the question of what brings us into being interested in a healing art of any kind, whether it's a body-oriented art or a psychotherapeutic healing art or a combination thereof, relational healing form. And I think it always, when I say to myself with that inquiry, it always brings me back to my own suffering. And what certainly brought me into the healing arts was my own need to be healed. And perhaps that resonates with others, and my own exploration in healing. And for me, it was very much two-pronged. I got very interested in humanistic psychotherapies and various therapy groups in the late 60s, early 70s, through the 70s. And I got very interested in body work. And I found that working with the body directly was very helpful for me, because my tendency was really to disconnect, to disembody, and to not be here, really. And that was the way I had to protect myself. So being worked with through the body and working with myself through the body was incredibly helpful in meeting those places in myself which were otherwise very hard to hold and heal. So I got very interested in my own organizational personality, my own self-system, and how, and still am, and still working with it, and how it tends to protect, take a very protective form when it really doesn't have to. And it's sort of like the self-system is very interesting. There's a great book, and you may have come across, The Eye of the Vortex by Rodolfo Linus, a neuroscientist. He talks about the organization of self neurologically, and cellular consciousness, which is really a powerful thing to understand, I think, and how our self-system is inherently predictive and defensive in nature. So if we've learned to protect a certain way, we're going to expect that kind of experience again and continue to protect yourself from it, even when we don't have to. And that's the kind of territories I've been looking at in myself and others early on. And that, combined with the body and understanding how experience is very much held in an embodied way and manifests cellularly, really, as an expression of consciousness and experience, has been very powerful for me. So that was my starting point, my own journey. The other piece that was incredibly helpful for me, and still has been Buddhism and meditative practices, and a Buddhist perspective on the nature of suffering and life and joy and sorrow and the nature of self, and how to hold that in what we call witness consciousness, the ability to hold oneself with space and with some humility and compassion, because sometimes, I don't know, as health practitioners, maybe you could relate to this, sometimes it's easier to hold another in compassion than to hold yourself, and that's a big one for a lot of us. So how can we find that compassionate heart for ourselves? I think if we're really going to deepen into a healing relationship with another, we have to find that compassionate heart for ourselves also. So I think that's a journey for a lot of us, because we have to get past what protects us from reconnecting with that heart. My journey in bodywork started really in 1975 when I took a massage training in San Francisco, and there was a piece of the training on Dr. Stone's work. And Dr. Stone was the osteopath who developed polarity therapy. And I got very involved in a group of early people around his work, which included Jim Said, Ans Blaze, Ray Castellino, and some others, and just trying to figure out what in the world Dr. Stone was up to. And what really grabbed me from his work was his work with what he called the neuter essence. He had his own language. We all develop our own language for things. And how do we communicate what is a perceptual experience in ways that are helpful? I think that's another area that is important to look at. So Dr. Stone had these terms: the neuter essence, the ultrasonic core, meaning the core of dynamic stillness that resonates through the natal cord, through the embryological core. And he was very aware of field phenomena. The field phenomena are laid down at conception by the long tide, or primary respiration at its roots, through what we call conception ignition, which is quite a powerful process to understand, and that continues throughout our life. And I got very entranced in how he worked very gently in stillness with those relationships of what he called primary energy. And I knew that he was influenced by Dr. Sutherland, and Dr. Sutherland's work in that. And I ended up going to osteopathic college to find out more about really Sutherland's work. And part of my training was to apprentice in an osteopathic office for, I think I was there for about 2.5 years. And that was a great experience. And there was a cranial osteopath in the office and who passed the work and his understanding onto me. And he was very much into fluids and the nature of what Sutherland called the potency within the fluids, or the life force, the organizing principle that steps down, in Sutherland's words, that transmutes into the fluids of the embryo and is with us throughout life, that ignites as a healing potency, as an ordering force. The main thing I was encouraged to was to be still and receptive, which was very interesting, because that wasn't easy for me, because I could be a great doer, getting things moving, helping people get their systems moving, but that isn't always very helpful, because it can override what really needs to occur. And you can never know what's needed in another person's system. They may need to be with what they're with in a different way, perhaps. That was very powerful ground. And around the same time, earlier than that, I had started teaching polarity therapy work and tried to create a cohesive 2-year program around polarity therapy. Met a colleague, and we organized a training here in Britain together. And around 1986, an osteopathic colleague, Claire Dolby, asked me to start a cranial course outside of the osteopathic profession. But I think she was a bit afraid that some of the principles might be lost or not spread in a wider way. And it was sort of it was sort of a process of fools rush in where wise people fear to tread, I think, because it was a huge thing to take on. And we developed, the first training we developed was a 36-day training over a year. It was quite condensed, really, and it's quite a mixed training because we thought we needed to teach a range of principles from osteopathic practice. So it was really a mixed biomechanical and partly biodynamic training. We looked at the fluids and the potency, but it was largely CRI-oriented training. And then towards the end of the training, we tried to shift people to a deeper appreciation of the tides. And then the idea was then to then take people deeper into the work in advanced courses. And that it's kind of like recreating in a mini scale what you might do in osteopathic practice, where you would learn biomechanical principles, you would learn vertebral dynamics, you would learn a biomechanical language and orientation, which is kind of mental orientation of particulars. There's the old saying, find it, fix it, and leave it alone. So the idea is you would find a biomechanical resistance, you would adjust it to remove it in some way and let the system reorganize around that. But it largely comes from a mental set of analysis and doing. You're working with motion testing, analysis, making decisions about what should occur in another person's system, applying those decisions and seeing the results. So it's a certain mental set. Around 1992, we had a tutors meeting at Karuna, and we all were clear that we were not actually teaching what we were practicing, that we were teaching what we thought we should be teaching in terms of a curriculum and bringing people along a certain way, but we didn't think it was working so well, actually, because people weren't necessarily coming to advanced courses and weren't necessarily carrying through their interests. So we decided to change the curriculum at that point, but it took 10 years to actually change the curriculum at Karuna.
So, remember where you left off?
So we just had a little break in the filming. I was sharing about in 1992 we made a decision to change the curriculum. Then it took about 10 years to change over for two major reasons. One, so that we were all the tutors and assistant tutors, and we have a very structured teaching program where we are a school. It's not dependent on me as a particular teacher. So we teach collaboratively and cooperatively and collegiately, if you like, and we bring people along in the teaching structure. So everyone had to be congruent in their own clinical work with what we were doing in class, or else it wouldn't be real, and it wouldn't be honest. So it took time to make that change. In the meantime, I had been asked to teach work in the States and in Switzerland. So I started to teach early forms of what became known as Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy or Craniosacral Biodynamics, which again were mixed in various places. So I taught in California, in Boston, in Boulder. I taught in Zurich and Spain also for a short period. And a lot of the tutors at Karuna, especially Catherine Uclea, Colin Perot, Claire Dolby, also started teaching away. So the ideas started to spread. It would be before this, craniosacral therapy as a form outside of osteopathy tended to be quite CRI oriented and quite biomechanically oriented. Work reflection, extension, patterns, motion testing, unwinding processes. Unwinding, by the way, comes from the work originally of Viola Fryman, but that's a whole other conversation. So it tends to be quite an analytical doing process, working with a certain level of rhythm that was called craniorhythm, or the craniorhythmic impulse. Dr. Sutherland didn't really orient to that. He talked about the tide, and that's a whole other conversation. Anyway, so what happened, wherever I taught, it was a snapshot of where the curriculum was in a particular time, but the curriculum at Karuna kept changing, and I couldn't necessarily bring those changes into places where I was teaching within a certain framework. So there was kind of this leapfrogging occurred, and different people trained with me at different times and took the work out at different times. So it's interesting to see how that all has unfolded over the years. At Karuna, we have kept working on the curriculum over the last 10 years, and where I'm just about happy with what we're teaching now. It's taken a long, long time. And we've come to a fully, what I consider to be a fully biodynamic orientation. I brought the term biodynamics into the craniosacral field in 1995. I got the term from Dr. Becker's work. Dr. Becker used the term biodynamic potency, and a lot of the work at Karuna at the time was focused on the potency within the fluids, the biodynamic potency and its relationship to conditional forces. So we start to shift the work from an orientation to the tension patterns and conditional patterns in the system to the forces that actually generate them. So it was a real perceptual shift, and also a shift in orientation from trying to either understand what the patterns were through motion testing or analysis, or through following patterns to edges, to really allowing the patterns to be the forms that bring your orientation awareness to the forces that organize those forms, and that's really critical. And once you have a relationship to the forces, both universal and conditional, that organize a form of suffering, you can then hold them both in compassion. And Carl Jung wrote beautifully about this towards the end of his life. He talked about the nature of the transcendent function, or the transcendent faculty. And he didn't mean something transcending in a kind of mystical way. He said that quite elegantly and quite biodynamically, if you like, that it's the role of the therapist to hold both universal and conditional forces within their awareness until they come to balance, until they come to what we call dynamic equilibrium. And what we teach very much now in the course is to hold that equilibrium in awareness, and you deepen and widen your perceptual field, and you go through that neutral, as Dr. Becker would say, to the deeper organizing forces. And we're always working to deepen and deepen. And at the heart and core of all organization is dynamic stillness. And so if you hold the form, the forces that organize that form in awareness and orientation, and as you deepen and widen to the stillness, in Dr. Becker's words, something happens beyond the conditions. And in Jung's terms, the system naturally transcends the conditions and can move to another level of functioning. So in the transcendent function, you hold the forces in equilibrium and deepen until the universal manifests in such a way that the system can transcend the suffering and the conditions that it's currently holding. And that's very much the heart of our biodynamic work. In the course now, the course very much starts out with an orientation to a state of presence, which I call it a being state. I talk about the nature of what I call source, being, and self. And the role of the therapist is to learn to enter a state of being, a state of presence, where their self system is suspended temporarily, and they're not of that in the relational field anymore. And they settle, the intention is to settle into a very basic state of presence, which is inherent at the core of our being. and from that state of presence to generate a negotiated relational field, which I call a being-to-being field, where there's a connection being to being, where something resonates, where there's a sense of mutuality and interconnection that's natural to us, but becomes very obscured by the conditions and the contingencies we've met in life, very obscured by our ego system, our self system, our needs, our fears. So we suspend all that. We enter a state that is not of that and form a relationship to the other from that state. And in that negotiated contact, we learn, I developed something early on. I developed the idea of practitioner fulcrums and the negotiation of contact many years ago, with the idea of it being a kind of ritual of contact, that you bring awareness and connection and contact to another person's system in a consistent way each time, almost like a ritual. That the person's consciously and pre-consciously knows the territory they're entering because of the consistent framework you enter it from with them. So the first seminar is largely about the state of presence in relationship. We organize what we call the being-to-being fields. We work with the idea of unconditional acceptance at the level of being. I bring in some wonderful older analytical work from Winnicott and others about the holding field, and the work from Frank Lake about the nature of being and the basic needs of being, which are really about recognition and acknowledgement and unconditional acceptance at that level of being received and mirrored. And I find that if you can generate a cohesive relational field where you're oriented to the nature of that person's being from your being, something very deeply starts to occur. And from that territory, you learn to orient to primary respiration as long tide and fluid tide. And so you're connecting to the being nature of the person, which is a universal, and you're connecting to the universal forces which support that being. And in that resonance, which is an expression of health at its deepest level, you then enter the territories that need to be held, being to being, if you like. So the first seminar is largely about that, and learning to generate a relational field, a holding environment, being able to reclaim basic trust, really, in relationship itself. We learn to, from there, orient to primary respiration, first in ourself. What I have students do now is we do a lot of meditative and contemplative exercises on both sensing the tide within you as a fluid sensory form, or a fluid sensory form, or a fluid sensory body, if you like. So I have people learn to hold the whole of their mind-body field as a sensory whole, which is quite powerful, and settle into that, and from there start to orient to the fluid systems. And once they have a sense of the inner tide, then I have them deepen and widen towards long tide. And we do this as a meditative process every day. They work with that at home. So usually by about the third seminar, people can sense primary respiration within and around themselves. And one of the prerequisites before touching another person by the third seminar is to sense primary respiration relative to your own system. So it also means that you have to have done some of your own work. You have to have some cranial work, have whatever kind of work that helps clear the space, so you can be with that more universal support for yourself. And what I find is very clear, that if you have a sense of that universal within yourself, it's much easier to orient to it in relationship to another person's system and another person's being. So from that sense of being and being present, from that core, that nucleus of presence, which we are, in Buddhism is called the knowing faculty, that which knows, which is there from the moment of conception, if not before, our most basic sentience. We learn to be with that, We learn to be with the universal forces that support us, and then as we orient to another, that resonates, and their system begins to resonate with that territory over time. I find it can take a number of sessions, 5 or 6 sessions, or more, depending how traumatized that individual is. But eventually that resonance occurs. And so that's the territory very much of the first seminar. We work with stillness, the idea of entering stillness and seeing how that resonates in a person's system. And that starts the work off from that point. Is this the kind of thing you're asking?
That's perfect, yeah.
How many time was on that?
We're checking our time here.
Yeah. Just keep going, Franklyn.
So we've gone 23 minutes so far.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah.
So we're doing time checks here.
Doing time checks, and what you're explaining is really why your system of craniosacral is very different from others because of that relational piece that you're saying.
Yeah, the one thing that's the relational piece is very important.
Yes.
And within the training, we also build in relational skills, both verbal skills in terms of working with activation and traumatic impact. I'm sure all good courses have that built in.
And is that based on the Peter Levine work or just other trauma?
It's a combination of, it's a combination of really cranial work, understanding how to hold traumatic activation, autonomic activation, etc., within the context of the tide and prime respiration. And it is very influenced by Peter's work, who I know quite well. It's also influenced very much by core process work. That's been a piece in core process psychotherapy from the beginning, entering witness consciousness, working with things in present time, bringing people into their felt experience of it in the present, not getting lost in it. So that's very much part of that territory also. What we do in the training, we start building those skills in relationally from the first seminar, where we work with what we call being-to-being fields, which are very heart-centered. So we teach people to learn to come into the heart center, to notice what's there for themselves, to orient to another from there, and see what interaction occurs from that space. Starting in the second seminar, the whole course is really based on Dr. Becker's inherent treatment plan. And the first step of the inherent treatment plan is to generate and set up a relational field. It's my interpretation of the inherent treatment plan. So the first step is that relational field has to settle before anything else could possibly happen. And a basic trust has to be established before anything else could possibly happen. And once that is there, and you're resonating with another at that state of presence, and you're orienting to prime respiration relative to the client's midline, long tide level is very helpful because it's never in shock; it's a universal. And you watch the pacing of that. What starts to occur is something very, very important. When you first meet the person's system, very commonly it will be very, very active. It will show you lots of patterns. It will manifest a CRI level of activity, and it's somewhat sometimes if it's in a positive vein, it's like meeting an old friend after 10 years or something, and everything comes out all at once. And then as your friend holds you in, kindness and compassion and real receptivity, you kind of settle, and then what's important begins to emerge from all of that. So very commonly you meet a person's system and there's lots of shifts and patterns, lots of history being shown. And as you maintain, you just let it all be there, you don't follow it, you don't grab onto it, you acknowledge it. If there's suffering, it must be acknowledged and held, but you keep orienting to the health and prime respiration from that perspective. And eventually what starts to happen is a sense of something shifting. Through the resonance of your being-to-being connection, of your orientation to prime respiration as a universal organizing, ordering force of health, that resonates in the person's system, and you sense the shifting occurring, which I call the holistic shift, where there's a sense of things slowing down, almost coming out of phase and deepening and widening. And you have this sense of the whole system dropping. And we all have experienced that. And we introduced that at the beginning of our second seminar, because by that time, with their people's practice experience, they would have experienced that. So now we can orient them to it. I find the course is laid out in such a way that a piece isn't given till we think people have already experienced it and need a language and an understanding of it. So we try to layer the pieces over time in such a way that it's relative to the possibility of a person's perceptual experience already being there. So the second seminar, we orient people to the holistic shift and the idea that you deepen and widen with it. And that's the next step in the inherent treatment plan. The holistic shift begins to emerge and it begins to deepen. So once you have the relational field in place and that cohesiveness of relationship and that orientation to universals are present, this deepening can occur. There's a basic trust emerging in the field. The person can let go really into not just trusting you as a practitioner, as a professional, but actually trusting the forces that support them in this life. And that's a huge shift. And I find it incredibly touching when it happens, in a person's system. And then in the second seminar, we then bring in the tissue field and embryology and how the tissue field is organized through the inherent forces from the field manifesting in the fluids through transmutation. And we look at tissue motility, but we always look at tissue motility in relationship to the potency within the fluids and the fluid tide and the whole. So if we're teaching a new piece, let's say coming into relationship to the sphenoid bone or the occiput, we have people go through every step each time: relational field, settling, holistic shift, deepening, orienting to a particular, sensing the whole, having a sense of the fluid sensory body, having a sense of the fluid tide, and then including the tissues. And then the motility is sensed as part of the greater whole. And excuse me, I'm talking too much, aren't I?
No.
We're just checking the timing of the recording. Okay. I'm just going to give you a little brief review of the first few seminars, I guess. So we start to, in the second seminar, in the first seminar, we also looked at the idea of the still point as a resonance with the deepening of the practitioner's stillness. So we have an interesting way of orienting people to still point now through, again, resonance through stillness, which I think is also common in the field now. In the third seminar, we look at shifting perceptual fields. They've already done contemplative exercises within themselves where they've learned to sense their own tide within them, the long tide, entering stillness, hopefully too, and then they start to learn to shift their perceptual fields relative to a client's system in the same way, until they can, ideally, by the end of maybe seminar 5, hold a wide perceptual field oriented to every layer at once, and deepening with an appreciation of whatever emerges. How we teach the holistic shift now in the second seminar is that the person deepens with that, deepens and widens, and it's very open to any possibility of any level of healing process emerging from that shift, because you really don't know what may emerge. In the third seminar, we kind of fill that out a bit, and we look at the kinds of processes that may arise from the deepening of the holistic shift. Mid-tide phenomena may emerge, the tidal potencies may start to shift, a particular form of organization may manifest around I'm losing my voice.
Should we just cut for a moment?
It's okay.
It's okay.
A particular form may organized around a particular fulcrum, and then you're kind of into the idea of the state of balance, which is a term I came up with many years ago, a state of dynamic equilibrium within the forces. I don't have people follow tension patterns to edges. I don't teach functional techniques. I don't teach anything that would lock the system up at a particular level. The intention is to deepen with the neutral. And if that neutral can't deepen, well then you work with certain augmentation skills, which I can talk about a little later, that help the system deepen. But the whole principle is to let the forces manifest, just to facilitate a context beyond a person's everyday life where those forces can manifest. You create a safe container, a holding field for that to occur. The potency is incredibly intelligent and will take on board that context that this is a different situation. We're entering really, what we create really is sacred space. It's very shamanistic in that sense. And as the holistic shift deepens, mid-tide phenomena may emerge and you find you're in that territory, but then that still can go further. Or the holistic shift can continue to deepen and deepen, and you find that long tide emerges and the whole process occurs through long tide phenomena, or you enter the dynamic stillness very directly, and healing intentions emerge then directly from the stillness, which is a beautiful place to get to with a person. So we teach the holistic shift in a very open way in that sense. In Seminar 3, we look at mid-tide phenomena in relationship to the deepening and what I call now the emergence of a healing intention. So again, a healing intention can emerge from the holistic shift at any level. In Seminar 4, we look at augmentation skills within mid-tide that help the system deepen, if it can. Those skills relate to naturally occurring phenomena as opposed to something imposed from the outside. We start to look at other expressions of the inherent treatment plan, long tide, emergence, later dynamic stillness. So those intentions move right through the training course. In Seminar 5, we look at birth process. By this time, we've done a lot of work. We talked a lot about embryology and prenatal experience, so that's in the field. We look at birth process in Seminar 5. All tissue patterning is oriented back to birth process or prenatal process. So the whole course from that point onwards in terms of conditioning and conditioned wounding looks at our earliest experiences, because as we deepen through the holistic shift, those early experiences will emerge and they must be acknowledged. The practitioner must be able to differentiate the experiences they're seeing and sensing and observing and be able to hold them with compassion and awareness. So that's brought in quite early also. So that's a bit of I kind of went into the early parts of the training. I don't know if that was helpful or useful at this point.
Very useful.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of the teaching of the work, a lot of I came up with a lot of language over the years because there wasn't any in the craniosacral field. So I came up with the idea of practitioner fulcrums, the relational field, the negotiation of contact. I remember once when I was in osteopathic college, I went to this is a funny one. I went to a cranial course that was given at the college or through the college, and I was quite a young, kind of practitioner, and I was paired up with someone who was much more experienced, and he got on the table, and I put my hands on him, and he jumped off the table and said, "Get out of my system!" And I said, "Sorry, didn't even know I was in the system." And then he started talking about setting up some kind of fulcrum, keeping back, and so it's been quite a journey for me around that, and learning to really respect another's boundaries, and really realize that I don't have to go to anything; it's already all there, and the perceptual qualities we develop are sort of like you're standing on the beach, the beautiful summer days, which have been rare this summer here in England, and you're there and you're holding this wide perceptual field. You have your midline, you have this wide perceptual field, and you just enter a receptive state, and everything is there at once. The clouds in the sky, the sea spray that's touching you, the sounds of the children laughing, the surf coming in, the boat on the water, the seagull in the air. You don't have to go to any of it to know it's there. And it's exactly the same working with a person's system. It's all there. You know, that's why you as a practitioner, when you're holding someone's toes, know that the sphenoid bone is torsioned. You know, it's all there at once. And you know that through the whole, because the whole manifests that. The sphenoid is not separate from the whole, as an example. You can be holding someone's toes and a pattern emerges, and you know that's organized around the right hip. You know, you don't have to go to it. You don't have to invade the person's system. You don't have to traction the tissues to know that. It presents itself to you. It's a communication, and you have to be present for that. By the end of the training, I'm very, very happy if a person can rest in stillness, can hold a wide perceptual field, can orient to every level of upon respiration, can differentiate CRI phenomena or autonomic activation from mid-tide, can orient to mid-tide inertia in various ways, and fluid tide work can orient to the long tide and stillness, and can be present for the arising of whatever healing process is emergent from whatever level, and have a right relationship to it. Because what's appropriate at one level will stop the process at another level. If a person is manifesting lots of CRI, there's lots of shock, there's lots of association, you have to help them resource, you have to work to help their system process a certain level of shock that's there, you have to help them slow their pacing down or mobilize or whatever is appropriate. So you need to be a bit more active there, perhaps. You have to help them enter the stillness together. You have to deeply resonate with health. When so those kinds of skills are helpful there. When you're in mid-tide, you're largely working through resonance and augmentation of naturally occurring processes, the expression of potency, the expression of fluid drive in the system, as it occurs, the expression of space at the height of inhalation as it naturally occurs, etc. So you're working with natural phenomena. In long tide, a level of healing emerges. It's all through resonance. In the dynamic stillness, it's all through appreciation, really, and love. If you enter the dynamic stillness directly, it's like entering a darkness. You may notice 10 minutes has gone by and you didn't know where it went because you were in a place that's timeless, really. And then you notice many, many things have happened in the person's system. So I'm very happy if a person can hold those territories by the end of the training and have a right relationship to what's emergent, and then they'll have a real base for learning from that point. In terms, again, of teaching work, the work spread in varied forms. I know some people are still teaching things that they have taught 10 years ago. Some people are taking a more functional approach. At Karuna, we've really, I think, have organized a very workable and very deep way of approaching biodynamics in a layered way, in a layered training process, where a person really is in a very kind of Taoist doing, not doing space, an appropriate right relationship with what's emergent. I'm still teaching. It's amazing when you hit 62, you wonder what's next in your life. But I'm still teaching. I'm teaching at Karuna. I'm teaching New York now. I'll probably be teaching at least one cycle in Germany, and then I might start thinking of retirement. I'd like to do some more teaching DVDs. I'm rewriting the cranio texts to bring them up to date because they were written in 1995, a long time ago, and they're quite mixed texts, really. And so that's coming along. I still seem to have a lot of work to do, basically. I'm very appreciative of all the work everyone else is doing, because this work has become quite well known now in the world. There are people teaching forms of biodynamics in Australia, New Zealand, throughout Europe. not necessarily people I've had anything to do with, but the idea of the work has kind of exploded in many ways. And that can't be but a good thing. Is this helpful?
This is very helpful. Thank you so much, Frank. I remember Claire Dolby saying that, suggesting that that you should start a school, because she said you knew so much more than everybody else.
Oh, that's very kind of her.
And
You mean in college?
in college, yes.
It was very fun. I didn't know more than anyone else, but it was very well. That's a big thing to say. But it was funny. I remember that I had a private practice of my own at the time, even while I was in college. Not an osteopathic practice, but a kind of mixed polarity cranial practice. And I was also doing psychotherapy too. So I think about. I had a very nice practice. About 60% of my clients were polarity cranial people at the time, and about 40% were psychotherapy clients. So it's a kind of nice mix for me. The psychotherapy clients were quite long-term, ongoing kind of work, which was very wonderful. And that was balanced by the variable kind of work in cranial work, where some people are short-term, some people are long-term, some people are there for their pain, which is fine. If we can help alleviate suffering at any level, it's wonderful. Some people are there more to heal deeper woundings in themselves, not just physical pain, but something about the nature of their psyche that has been suffering, really. So I had an interesting practice, but a lot of the students in the college would come to me for work, and even some of the professors. So it was really funny. I started this practice going. So, but that's kind of Claire to say that.
Yeah, and so she recognized that and encouraged you. I remember her saying
she really twisted my arm to start a try. I didn't want to.
She did.
She really twisted my arm. Dear Claire is still teaching at Karuna all these years later, amazingly enough.
That's wonderful.
And still amazingly supportive and wonderful, and a lovely teacher in her own right, and works beautifully with infants and children too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Well, see,
Into that.
Yeah, so hello again. I've been asked to talk a bit about the pre and perinatal paradigm and its relationship to cranial work and maybe life in general. I first encountered the idea of pre and perinatal consciousness really in 1979. My wife had just come back from working with William Emerson. William Emerson, if you know, is one of the fathers of pre and perinatal psychology. He worked with Frank Lake, who is really the father of pre and perinatal psychology in England. And then Maura Sills started to work with him. And then when we were in California, William had moved back and continued to work with him. And she came back one night full of her experiences of the work, and we lived in this very womb-like space at the time in Berkeley, California, and my eyes started fluttering, and I went, and I ended up spontaneously going into a birth process, and coming up with all sorts of interesting things. And at that point I figured there must be something important in this for me, because I didn't really, I had kind of discounted it really before then. I was much more into Nia Reichen screaming and breaking out my defenses. So which was useful at the time, because I wasn't in contact with that sense of power in myself. Although I did go into dissociation a lot, I didn't realize it. Anyway, so then I thought, well, this is something I must follow up, and I started to do trainings with William, and then we got really connected, and he was very interested in cranial work, and we started to collaborate. So by 1985 we were collaborating with each other, and I was adding cranial pieces into his work, and I helped William look at the stages of birth, and we end up with 4 basic stages depending on the baby's experience, etc. So it became very much an active thing in myself, and I started working very much with my psychotherapy clients in that territory. And then I started to look at the repercussions of pre and perinatal experience as you're working. Obviously they're still there, and here we are in this intimate connection with a person's system, physically and relationally in cranial work. And as the relational field, and as your relationship deepens, and becomes safer, the territories that are unsafe start to emerge, and these kind of very, very early origins, even preconception, for that matter, about how it was to come into this life. So I've discovered, and I'm sure you may be aware of that. So it became more and more part of my work. And we all start to introduce embryology into the work. Embryology is very important. Those formative forces at work manifesting form and shape. But we have to also know that the embryo is a sentient being, and that there's sentience, that there's spirit manifesting there. And there are stages of being, of spirit embodying in form also. And I hold that and include that in the coursework. And the way I look at what's become known as ignition processes is very much through the prenatal and perinatal experience. There are three primary ignitions: conception, heart ignition, and birth ignition. And each relate to being. It's not just about energies. Conception ignition is when the long tide spirals into the conceptus, and a quantum level field is generated of organization with the midline. We're basically creatures of light, and that field manifests as forces in the fluids, and is really the ground of being. It's the matrix or ground of being that being enters. When the heart unfolds in form around the 4th to 5th week after conception, and the heart meets the midline, and the body folds are complete, there's a form now for being to embody into. And heart ignition is the embodiment of being as we're drawn into the heart center as spirit. And that's quite an extraordinary experience. And I've had incredibly touching experiences with clients reclaiming that heart territory for themselves and really feeling their embodiment at a very deep level of being. It's quite amazingly beautiful. And birth ignition, as you all know, is that territory where the potency really manifests in the fluids, where there's a potentization of fluid, of potency in the fluids. And that's about the empowerment of being here. So when we look at the stages of ignition, we're looking at prenatal experience, because that can all be affected by the field that being is entering, and how that field is experienced, the relational field, the maternal field, mother's experiences, the field she's being held in, the cultural field, the world field. That little one is now the center of all fields, and it's quite powerful. And mother's mediating the experience of all fields to that little one. So prenatal experience will affect those ignition processes very directly. Have I been received in my being? Have I been acknowledged? Am I unconditionally seen and held? Has my being been mirrored in this form? Can I rest in just being? Donald Winnicott had this beautiful understanding where he said this is the role of primary caregivers, to allow the little one to simply be, to protect the little one from overwhelming impingement that would take the little one out of being. So an impingement for Winnicott was anything that takes the little one out of simply being, of resting in being. And then the reflection of being, in Frank Lake's terms, he talked about the mirroring being to being from mother and father and primary caregivers. If mother and father can be in their being state, the little one starts to, in that mirroring, sense its own nature as being. And Winnicott said you must help the little one simply be, and then learn to explore its world in a way that's supportive. Not thrust the world at little ones, or overwhelm the little ones with our own needs. And that's quite a powerful territory as a parent. I tell you, my biggest learning processes have been as a father, as a dad, for both a birth daughter and an adopted daughter. Extraordinary learning. It's been incredibly humbling at times, that easily brought me to my knees. And really paying attention, Franklyn, pay attention to this little one, not to yourself. Well, pay attention to yourself in the way that holds that little one. So there's a whole territory of being, and something that can be forgotten in the cranial field somehow is that we are sentient beings. It's not just about the embryo. In embryology, the embryo is the form we manifest being and spirit in, and the form we in this incarnation. And we take on our human beingness in that form. So we take on, the kind of soul nature of a human being as we incarnate, as opposed to becoming a cat or a dog, I guess. In terms of spirit or essential being, essential state of presence, we incarnate in this human form, and we take all on that means, both as a human being, our culture, our history, our family, the whole deal. And it's a huge thing to hold, really. We don't always think of it that way, but it is a huge thing we take on. We take on mom and dad's consciousness. We take on the familial ancestral consciousness. Is all present while we're holding someone's sphenoid bone. So it became more and more important to be aware of holding the little ones as we're holding the adult, if we're working with adults, because many levels of process experience and many levels of the experience of being are present as we hold someone. So the pre and perinatal paradigm, I think, is quite important in that. Is that helpful?
That is huge, and what is wonderful for me is to experience your level of involvement in it so far back.
Yes, it went way
Yes.
back. Yeah.
Yes, because
yeah.
I'm so familiar with Ray's background, but
I-
where you come in is amazing.
I was there in the early days with William, and William has come to Karuna every year to teach, or almost every year, and I co-teach with him, and I think we both mutually influenced each other in various ways. So I'm very much working with containment and pacing and slowing things down, setting up being to being fields, setting up. It was a very core process way of working, being in present time, not regressing, but really entering the territory in the present. And I like William's new term for it. He calls it egression.
I saw that online. I love that.
Where
Yes.
you're entering the territory in the present, which is really.
So he's come a long way too, because he was much more cathartic and primal.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
And I feel we all stand on the shoulders of giants, where we needed those people doing the Reichian and the core energetics and
Absolutely,
bioenergetics,
yes.
and now
Well,
we can all evolve.
yeah. Well, yeah. These last few times William's come to Karuna, done beautiful work on preconception and conception experience. Very paced, very very resonant. He has this new thing he calls the spirit pulsation, where you sense the pulsation of being and spirit in your form through your heart center. Very resourcing work. So yeah, he's come a long way too.
Wow, wonderful. And I'm also very clear and very grateful that all the trauma work that's out there, when you add your component of the biodynamic cranial, it takes it to a whole nother level that people can't get to otherwise.
It takes it deep. It does. It takes us to primary forces.
Yes, which is fabulous. So, going on from there, just a little piece before we close on your wonderful new book, Being and Becoming, that's just out.
Well, thank you. Being and Becoming has been quite a journey for me. It started, at Karuna, we have the whole other side of the training is our psychotherapy training. It's an MA training, so we're accredited by a university, and we have 2 different MAs. And we have, and the university sets up very strict academic structures and et cetera, and we have an external moderator. And about 10 years ago, our external moderator, who was an analyst, said to us, you have all the pieces in place. This is in the psychotherapy training, but they're not integrated enough. So I'd like you to see on your theoretical paradigm, integrating the material a bit clearer. So that's set. I was given the task to do that. So that set me off on a 9-year journey of revisiting object relations theory, really getting into the work of Ronald Fairburn, who can easily be translated into a Buddhist context. I think he was incredibly an incredibly aware person, but you have to translate his work out of analytical language, because he was talking to analysts, and it's confusing because he was using analytical terms but didn't mean the same thing as Freud. in using the same term. Like he meant something very different when he said ego than what Freud would mean, for instance. So I really got into that, and I got into the early people like Winnicott, of course Frank Lake. And Frank Lake, whose work I have always appreciated, has these endless charts and writings, and I spent 2 years taking apart Frank Lake's writings and putting them back together, and he was also very influenced by Fairbairn, so I looked at that, and so I started to look at all those psychodynamics, but through a Buddhist framework, because we were at Buddhist-oriented psychotherapy training, and that was really powerful for me to recycle. And in the end, it brought me to recycling territories within myself, and at least being aware, clearer in aspects of my own personality system and protective system. So it was really a personal journey at the same time. It still is. I'm still working on me. Perhaps we all are. Hopefully.
Yeah, we need to.
You know, and and so being and becoming came out of this. Started from the university suggestion, but it really became a very, very personal journey, and it's been incorporated within the core process training as a theoretical paradigm. But the beautiful thing about the core process work is that all of the theory is given with perceptual exercises and exchange sessions. So if we're looking at Fairbairn's work, you really start to look at your own nature of your own endopsychic structure and your own tendencies to withdraw, your own needy self, and your own the parts of you that tend to reject or defend, and how your central self is organized, and et cetera, and holding that with a lot of compassion, and getting a sense of the history of that in the present moment is quite powerful. So in the core side, we work a lot with exchange sessions and perceptual exercises that makes the whole thing come alive in an inquiry, which is quite important. The piece that's interesting too is understanding the nature of the shadow, because we all have our shadow aspects, and that sometimes in the cranial field gets lost, because there's huge politics and conflict can occur in our wonderful little field, which saddens me. I'm both loved and hated. It's quite extraordinary. I get lots of projections on me and all sorts of things. And the breath of life is magnificent. If we're all touched by the breath of life, it's an extraordinary experience. And the breath of life supports everything. It supports life. It doesn't differentiate between high and low, good or bad. A wounded need or a need arising out of love and compassion. It maintains everything in its loving arms, including our shadow. So everything is supported. We are so supported in all of our humanness. And what can happen if you don't hold an awareness of shadow as a practitioner, your own shadow can start to be activated and resonate and be stimulated. So we have to be very aware of our shadows in the field and take responsibility for them, because the breath of life supports it all, actually, which is quite beautiful. It's like that wonderful chapter in Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, which I love. I have many translations of it. I once studied the Tao Te Ching with a Chinese master in the original Chinese, in archaic Chinese. It's quite extraordinary. And there's a chapter where it's something like, the Tao treats all men as straw dogs. And what that means is that they used to have these sacrificial straw dogs in China that they would burn to the gods. And what the connotation is that the Tao treats everything as equal. Good. There's no good, bad, high, low. Everything is maintained in equilibrium, in dynamic equilibrium. So we have to watch that in ourselves, and we have to take responsibility for the shadow that does get activated. I'm still trying to do that, and it's not always easy, and it's not always it's not always something that we can hold in a way that doesn't get activated in relationship to other people. So that we have to take responsibility for that. So that's the other little piece around that I want to talk about. In Being and Becoming, I talk about the shadow in terms of what Fairbairn called repressed experiences, really, where the overwhelming badness is pushed down that we may have experienced prenatally or in early infancy or early childhood, because we can't manage it within our psyche. So the forces of repression, which is a feeling of badness, our self system is completely organized around feeling, tone, and affect, as is attachment systems. Attachment system is an expression of self. What sometimes gets lost in the attachment community is that attachment process is a manifestation of your self system. And in order to heal an attachment process, you have to heal your self system, your wounded self, actually. So an attachment system is an expression of selfhood. That sometimes gets lost. It's not a thing on its own. It's an important effect of the generation of self. And it manifests from very unconscious shadow places too, or can if it's insecure and wounded. So somehow or other we all have to hold that in awareness and not project it out on each other. Is that the kind of territory you wanted me to talk about?
Yes, and who was Being and Becoming written for? Originally, I guess it was the external.
Well, it started. Well, we actually didn't. I didn't write Being and Becoming for the university. It's a book that came out of the initial impulse to restructure our curriculum in a more cohesive way, and it threw me into really the work of wonderful people like Fairbairn and Winnicott and Stern in the analytical community, and Frank Lake's work in the pre and perinatal paradigm as part of that, not separate from that, and how that interrelates with my own Buddhist practice and understanding, and how that manifests as a healing form, which in terms of mindfulness practice.
Yes.
So it became a book. That wasn't the original intention.
Yes. So it became a book that, it seems to me, even though it is more a psychotherapeutic focus, that it's really helpful for craniosacral practitioners and really all practitioners.
Oh, that's wonderful. I hope so. I hope it has general interest. It's not an easy book necessarily, because it can be quite technical at times, I think. But I hope it's readable.
I think it is.
Oh, great.
It is.
I've gotten some good feedback around it, which is nice.
Yes, and it's pulling a lot of different disciplines together and making sense of it, integrating it.
Yeah, that was its intention.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
taking time out of your busy schedule to share all this wonderful information with us.
Kind of you to pop in.
Oh. Well, it's our pleasure. Thank you, Franklyn.
MeridianHolisticHealth.com